Are you ready for some spine-chilling, bone-chilling horror stories that will leave you questioning the safety of your own backyard? Tonight, we dive into the deepest, darkest corners of the wilderness and the homes where terror lurks. From footprints in the snow to shadowy figures in the forest, these tales will keep you up at night. But don't worry, you're not alone. Stick around, and let's explore these 3 haunting true stories together. Remember, if you enjoy this content, hit that like button, subscribe for more chilling stories, and don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. Let's get started. Story 1, The Unseen Stalker in the Woods. Brace yourself for the sheer terror I'm about to share with you. I don't even know if this is the right place to tell this story, but I can't think of anywhere else. I've spoken to everyone under the sun, my family, neighbors, friends, and even random news outlets, but it's never enough. I feel this inexplicable urge to warn as many people as possible about what's been happening to me. Here goes. It's November 2019, and while I'm writing this, the events I'm about to recount stretch back nearly a decade, around 2012 or 2013, to be precise. Back then, I was in my mid-20s, with a steady job and a girlfriend who's now my fiancée. I never went to college, so I'd been in the workforce for a while, and my life was unlikely to change drastically anytime soon. There was no reason for me to move far from home, so I didn't. At that point, my fiancée and I had just moved into my childhood home, which my parents kindly passed down to me as my first house. It's an ancient brick structure that my father inherited from his parents when he was in his 40s, so I was keeping it in the family. The house has undergone a few renovations, but the brickwork still betrays its age. Few brick homes exist in our area, making it stand out like a sore thumb. I kind of like that, it feels unique. Our neighborhood is very wooded, with houses spaced far apart. Our house sits at the end of the street, bordering the woods on 2 sides. The woods behind us are vast, truly immense. As kids, my siblings and I would explore them, but we never managed to map out even a fraction of the area. Some might find it intimidating, but I've always enjoyed the wild, so it didn't bother me. Plus, I thrive on being busy, so being isolated in my own little corner of the world suited me just fine. A few months after settling in, the strange occurrences began. It was during the winter, though I can't recall the exact month. All I know is that there was snow on the ground. It was a Sunday morning, the one day I allowed myself to sleep in. As I was heading to my pickup truck for my usual Sunday coffee, I noticed something peculiar in the driveway beside my vehicle. There was a trail of footprints in the snow. My first thought was that my fiancée had gotten up before me and gone outside for some reason. But as I examined the scene, I realized that wasn't possible. The trail led across our front yard and through a gap in our side yard fence, indicating the prints had originated from the woods. Moreover, the trail didn't lead anywhere near our house, ruling out the possibility that my fiancée had made them. I stood there, utterly perplexed. The prints didn't lead to any windows or around the house, they simply stopped at the driver's side door of my car. It was as if someone had walked directly from the woods to my car and then immediately turned back into the woods. It was bizarre. Later that day, I asked my fiancée about it, but she wasn't responsible. I wish I could provide more details about that first incident, but it happened so long ago that this is all I can remember. Fast forward to 2 winters later, specifically 2015, the year my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. One morning, I woke up and headed to my car. Whether it was a weekday or weekend, I can't be certain. As soon as I stepped outside, I knew something was terribly wrong. Footprints covered the entire property, driveway, near the windows, and around the perimeter of the house. The yard was blanketed in them. Despite my level-headedness, I admit I wasn't entirely calm. I was already running late for work, so I didn't have time to inspect the prints closely, but I didn't want to leave my fiancée in a potentially dangerous situation. I quickly checked the house and yard to ensure no one was lurking, but that was all I could manage with the limited time I had. As I pulled out of the driveway, I sent a text to my fiancée to prepare her for what she might see. That day, I left work early, my mind consumed by the situation. By the time I got home, my fiancée had made some unsettling discoveries. She beckoned me to the yard and pointed out one of the trails, saying it had been bothering her all day. Initially, I was confused, but then I understood what she meant. None of the footprints showed any shoe marks. I felt foolish for not noticing it sooner. Whoever had left the footprints had been walking barefoot. Who in their right mind would walk barefoot in freezing temperatures? My fiancé suggested it might have been an animal, but the prints clearly resembled human feet. We called my father, but he assured us he had never encountered anything like this in all his years living in the house. He advised me to grab my rifle and track down whoever had left the prints. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing it was my responsibility. My fiancé wanted to call the police, but I knew that would be pointless. We had no evidence of a crime, and I doubted trespassing warranted a full investigation. I told her I'd call the authorities if I found something in the woods, and she reluctantly agreed. The woods are vast, so I told myself I'd turn back once the sun started setting. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and ventured out. After about 30 minutes, I noticed something incredibly strange. The trail suddenly split into two diverging paths. I had no idea which one to follow. I initially thought the person had doubled back to confuse me, but then a more frightening thought crossed my mind: could there be more than one person out there? I had assumed I was tracking just one individual, but the possibility of multiple people had never occurred to me. That realization shook me to my core. Although I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of being outnumbered, I hesitated for a bit before deciding to turn back. It was getting dark anyway. As I walked back, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. It seemed impossible that two people could walk in the same prints without leaving any trace of a mistake. Maybe the person had walked backward to create the illusion of two people. Or perhaps someone had carried another person on their back and simply got tired. I wasn't sure which explanation was more disturbing. We eventually called the police that night, but as expected, they told us there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence of a crime. I told my fiancée I'd go into the woods again the next morning, but heavy snowfall that night erased all traces of the prints. My fiancée was terrified, but there was nothing we could do. Thankfully, that was the last incident of that winter. For several years afterward, nothing happened. We had almost forgotten about it altogether. During that time, my fiancée and I got engaged, and we focused on other aspects of our lives. If the story ended there, I wouldn't be telling it now. What follows happened less than a year ago, in early January. One morning, I woke up to find footprints all over my property. The memories flooded back instantly. My fiancée broke down in our bedroom, asking if we'd ever escape this nightmare. I had no answer for her. This time, the footprints led to my shed, and a number of tools were missing. Who knows what else those people had done? I was furious. I called my friend Jake, explained the situation, and asked if he'd help me. He's an avid outdoorsman and a more experienced hunter than I am, so I felt confident asking him for assistance. He agreed to join me a few hours later. My fiancée was understandably worried, but I assured her that Jake and I would be fine. We dressed for the cold and prepared for a long search. Jake had invested in a thermal scope for his AR-10, which would allow us to see in low visibility. I wasn't equipped with similar gear, so I'd still be effectively blind, but it was comforting to know at least one of us could see in the dark. I won't sugarcoat it, I was terrified by the time we set out. At first, Jake and I chatted as we walked, but after about 45 minutes, we fell into a somber silence. The gravity of the situation had settled over us both. I prayed to God that I hadn't dragged Jake into something terrible. I'm not sure how long we walked, but eventually, the track split into two separate paths. We followed the one on the left for a few minutes, but it abruptly ended. We retraced our steps to the fork, and Jake commented that whoever left the tracks clearly didn't want to be followed. I didn't want to dwell on it, so we continued following the prints in silence. There were at least 3 other dead ends that forced us to backtrack, wasting precious daylight. I marveled at how perfectly someone could walk backward to avoid leaving obvious signs of retracing their steps. It wasn't normal. The one silver lining, according to Jake, was that the dead ends likely indicated we were tracking just one person. As darkness fell, we realized we were deep in the woods, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. The trail didn't split for a long time afterward. Jake speculated that the person had given up on creating dead ends. After another 5 minutes, the footprints became noticeably deeper, suggesting we were getting closer. Suddenly, another set of footprints appeared alongside the original. Jake cursed and whispered that he had been wrong, there were likely 2 people. The sun had almost completely set, so Jake periodically checked his scope. The snow provided some visibility, but I was glad for Jake's equipment. We walked in complete silence. Suddenly, I felt Jake's arm press against my chest, motioning me to stop. He was staring straight ahead through his scope. I couldn't see what he was looking at, so I just kept watching him. He looked tense, almost holding his breath. I had never seen him so still. After about 20 seconds, he slowly moved toward the nearest tree and crouched down. I followed suit, not questioning his actions. He looked through his scope again, and I could see his hand trembling slightly. Another 20 seconds of absolute silence. I was on edge. I gently tapped his shoulder. He lowered his rifle and handed it to me. I looked through the scope and had to fight back a scream. There were 4 figures huddled in the snow. At first, I thought they were bears, but I quickly realized they were human beings. 2 were large and hunched over, and the other 2 were small. The smaller ones clung to a nearby tree, jerking their heads wildly. They were eating something I couldn't identify. Thermal scopes don't show facial details, but I could tell they were naked. It was the most terrifying sight I've ever witnessed. Eventually, the larger figures lifted the smaller ones from the tree and placed them on their shoulders. They then began walking deeper into the woods. I sat under the tree for what felt like an hour, waiting for any sign that they might have heard us. By the time we returned to the house hours later, I was surprised to find my fiancée still awake. She told me she couldn't sleep, knowing I was out there, and asked what we had found. I relayed the minimal details, but she was still horrified. We called the police that night, and they promised to search the woods the following morning. Jake agreed to stay overnight so we could assist the police in their search. The next day, the police searched the woods with our help but called it off after a few hours due to the partially covered-up footprints. My fiancé demanded they continue searching, but they said they couldn't justify a large-scale search over missing tools. I don't blame them, but it didn't bring us any closure. Jake and I knew what we had seen. Winter was approaching, and both my fiancé and I were worried those people would return. We're seriously considering moving, but haven't made any progress yet. I don't know what to think. I've shared this story with everyone I can. It's been going on for years, and none of my neighbors have experienced anything like it, which baffles me. I don't understand why my house is being targeted or what those people want. Some friends think they're harmless, while others tell me I'm in grave danger. I plan to secure my yard from the woods, but beyond that, I don't know what else to do. Hopefully, we can move soon. Story 2, The Pacific Crest Trail Stalker. Last summer, I decided to tackle a significant section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always loved hiking, especially solo trips. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the section, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and hike back over the course of a little more than a week and a half. It sounded straightforward enough at the time. The first few days went smoothly, just as I had expected. The trail was everything I had hoped for: endless stretches of towering trees and winding paths cutting through serene landscapes. I'm in decent shape, so I don't have to stop frequently when hiking. However, I don't hike in the dark, so every night I had to pitch a tent to get some rest. I prefer to keep a low profile, especially since solo hikers can attract unwanted attention. To minimize the chances of someone stumbling upon my campsite, I always set up camp a little off the main trail. Up until the third night, everything was perfect. But what I'm about to tell you is why I'm taking an extended break from hiking, or any wilderness exploration, for the foreseeable future. One night, I woke up with an eerie feeling that something was wrong. It was that gut instinct you can't explain but can't ignore. I looked around my tent, everything seemed normal inside, so I decided to check the campsite. I grabbed my rifle, a flashlight, and unzipped the tent. There was no one out there, no one I could see, at least. I returned to my tent and began checking my pack. That's when I realized my wallet was gone. At first, I thought I had misplaced it, maybe left it outside the tent or buried it somewhere in my gear, but after thoroughly searching everything, it became clear that someone had taken it. My personal information, cash, credit cards, everything was gone. How was that even possible? Had someone broken into my tent just to steal that one thing and leave? It was unlikely, but randomly misplacing it was very uncharacteristic of me. I reluctantly concluded that I had probably lost it myself. Things only got worse from there. Over the next few days, I noticed more items missing, small, seemingly random things, one of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. I knew I wasn't just misplacing everything. Someone was stealing my belongings. At first, I didn't want to believe it, but by the fourth day, it was undeniable. I was being stalked. There was no cell coverage on that part of the trail, so I couldn't alert anyone about my situation. I considered turning back but realized it would only save me a couple of days at best. There was no way I could hike either direction without sleeping, but I didn't feel safe pitching a tent in those woods with someone stalking me. It was a lose-lose situation. I remained calm and reminded myself that I had brought my rifle for a reason. Then, it hit me, why hadn't that person stolen my gun? It was almost as if they were deliberately messing with me. That night, I tied my tent shut from the inside, hoping that would keep them out if they returned. I stayed up as long as I could but eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. My plan worked. When I woke up the next morning, there was no sign that anyone had been in my tent. By then, the paranoia had fully set in. The isolation was getting to my brain, and every second of hiking was agonizing. I don't suffer from anxiety, but let me tell you, I've never felt worse in my life. Imagine being in my position, no options but to continue hiking despite knowing someone was lurking not far behind. The anxiety was constant, and I was unraveling. My mind started playing tricks on me. A rustling in the bushes turned out to be nothing. A shadow flickering at the edge of my vision vanished the moment I turned my head. The hallucinations got worse. I can remember most of them specifically, but the one that stands out the most is this: as I was walking, I felt myself step into an ankle-deep puddle of water that almost caused me to trip. I literally heard the splash and felt the cold water soaking my sock, but when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there in complete shock. It felt so real. I had no choice but to continue down the trail. As bad as the days were, the nights were always worse. I tied my tent shut and slept next to my rifle, but nothing alleviated the anxiety. At one point, I had to splash cold water on my face to calm myself down. The hallucinations mostly subsided after that. I'm not sure what I would have done if they had continued. The next night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps walking around my campsite. I quietly grabbed my rifle, preparing to confront whoever was there, but my body was frozen in fear. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but there was no way I was going to sleep after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up camp in a frenzy. My hands shook so badly I could barely tie my gear. I couldn't stay out there another night. I was so close, probably a day and a quarter's hike away from my car, maybe less if I pushed myself. I decided that I wouldn't stop to sleep that night. I'd push through the night to get off the godforsaken trail as quickly as possible. I hiked for hours as fast as my body would allow. When the sun started to set, I gritted my teeth and continued instead of pulling off to pitch my tent. By the time it was pitch black, I was so close, probably 2 hours away at most. I kept walking, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. I started second-guessing my decision. I had never hiked in the darkness before, and I was not prepared for how difficult it was. That in itself was scary enough. I kept going, trying to keep my breathing steady. About an hour passed, and I was getting closer. Then I heard it, somewhere behind me. I was sure I heard footsteps. I spun around and flashed my light, and to my horror, I saw something slink behind a tree. The adrenaline took over, and I aimed my rifle at the tree. I demanded that they come out in a loud voice. The figure stepped forward. It was definitely a human, but when I tell you it was the most barbaric-looking thing I'd ever seen, I'm not exaggerating. Words cannot describe what I was looking at. He was wearing nothing but a pair of my shorts, which I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin was scratched up in several different places, and his face was covered in hair. He started walking towards me, even though I had my rifle aimed at him. Before I could think, I fired a warning shot next to him. He jumped at the sound and instantly retreated, sprinting back into the woods. I was in shock. Without wasting another second, I turned around and went as fast as I could. By the time I made it out of the woods, I locked my car doors and called the police. When they finally showed up, they told me that I shouldn't stick around. I didn't need to be told twice. I was out of there that night. The craziest part of the whole thing, in my opinion, was the hallucinations. I didn't think such vivid hallucinations were even possible. It's going to be a long time before I go hiking again, and I can confidently say that when I do, I won't be alone. I would advise anyone planning on hiking the Pacific Crest Trail to be extremely cautious and carry a firearm. This experience is something I still think about often. Story 3: The Logging Crew's Nightmare. For the final story, prepare yourself for a tale that will haunt you long after you've watched this video. My best friend's father was a logger, specifically a tree saw operator. For those who don't know, a tree saw is a massive machine capable of cutting down giant trees and slicing them to specific lengths. His job involved grueling hours, often alone in the deep, secluded forests of the Pacific Northwest. The way his logging crew operated, he was paid based on the number of trees he cut down, rather than the hours he worked, so he would often push himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs as quickly as possible. Once he and his co-worker completed their part, the rest of the crew would come in to clear the fallen trees and transport them to the mill. While he spent about half of his time working alone, the other half was spent with his friend, Hank, another tree operator. They used radios to communicate, especially when they worked on opposite ends of the same job site. Several years ago, my friend's father and Hank were assigned to a remote job site high up on a mountain. It took the company over 3 weeks just to clear a road wide enough for their trucks and equipment to reach the site. By the time they began work, they were positioned in an extremely desolate part of the mountain. They were already 10 days in, making good progress, when they started hearing strange chatter over their radios. At first, the voices were muffled, just faint, static-laden murmurs that didn't make sense. They tried switching channels, but no matter what they did, the chatter followed them. Anyone who's used a standard radio knows how strange that is. It should be impossible for anyone to follow you when you're switching channels. As they progressed farther up the mountain, the voices became more distinct. They couldn't hear full conversations, but based on what they could make out, they both agreed that the tone of the conversation fragments felt off. My friend's father said it sounded almost casual at times, but the content was unintelligible. They also started finding strange signs that people had been there before them, random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small makeshift campsites. Like I said before, they were in a place so remote it was practically inaccessible, so these discoveries were deeply unsettling. No one should have been up there. One day, Hank came across a tent hidden just off a trail and called my friend's father over. They decided to investigate. Inside, they found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with the most disturbing things imaginable: multiple pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude sketches of children being molested. There were even photos of a fresh apple, indicating whoever owned it had been there recently. Hank wanted to pack up and leave immediately. My friend's father, ever the workaholic, insisted they finish the job. They agreed to limit radio communication to emergencies only and decided to keep working. That night, they sat in the camper unable to shake the dread that hung over them. The radio crackled to life again, and this time, they could make out snippets of a conversation between two men. They were talking about mundane things, collecting water and firewood, but the realization that these men were likely connected to the tent freaked my friend's father out. Hank wasn't as fazed, but my friend's father was losing it. The next night, my friend's father decided to confront them when he heard the men talking about gathering brush for a fire. He grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. The radio went silent immediately, and the men didn't respond. That silence was almost more unnerving than the chatter. Hank was upset that my friend's father had announced their presence, and the two of them got into a brief argument before deciding they'd escalate the situation the next day. Around midnight, Hank shook my friend's father awake, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first thing he noticed was the soft sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Hard pounding, he fumbled for his gun only to realize it wasn't loaded. He had no idea where his ammunition was. Hank was unarmed, and the idea of calling the police was laughable given their location. They both sat frozen as they heard the camper door handle jiggle. The door creaked open but didn't fully swing inward. Their camper was high off the ground, and there was no ladder or stool to climb up. Then came scratching, long, deliberate scratches along the outside of the door. For agonizing minutes passed. Finally, my friend's father nodded at Hank, signaling he was going to check it out. He moved quietly toward the door, gripping a flashlight in his shaking hand. Just as he reached the door, it burst open, and he was struck across the face with a knife. His pain was blinding. He fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard before he could recover. A man was on top of him, pressing the knife against his neck. Another man appeared, kicking him repeatedly in the head. Hank, without hesitation, leapt out of the camper and tackled the man with a knife. The second man bolted into the darkness, and the one Hank had tackled scrambled to his feet and followed. They disappeared into the forest. Hank helped my friend's father back into the truck, and they drove 2 hours to the nearest hospital. It was bad, his face was a bloody mess, and there was a cut across his eyes so severe it permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing came of it. 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew finished the job, one of their co-workers was found bound, gagged, raped, and murdered in a ditch. No arrests were ever made. To this day, my friend's father struggles with PTSD. His right eye, with its deformed pupil, constantly reminds him of that night. I've been terrified of deep woods for a long time now, mostly because of my friend's father's experience. I haven't heard from my friend or his father in years now, so I can only hope he's doing all right. If you enjoyed these chilling stories, hit that like button, subscribe for more terrifying tales, and don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. Stay tuned for more horror stories that will keep you up at night.